Bonington, 12 years older than any of his colleagues, was beginning to doubt whether he had enough remaining strength to try for the summit. In the warmth of the mess tent, Charlie had rigged up some makeshift inhalers to relieve their throats.
It's the only thing that softens it. Now, Pete, do you want some Irish stew?
Yes, please, with those vegetables. Where do you get the lamb from?
It's Tibetan frozen lamb. Huh?
Last delivery.
Yeah. It's that carcass we brought up.
Walked up by itself.
And you want some bread?
This was possibly the highest loaf of homemade bread that has ever been baked.
Gloves.
It's a bit gamey.
It's a bit, yeah, it's an acquired taste. Adrian hates it. But it makes a lovely stew in the pressure cooker.
I now realised that there was absolutely no way that I could keep up with Pete and Joe. In addition to that, I very much doubt if I could have even ever got back up to our previous high point. I was now so exhausted. And so I decided that I'd better drop back into a support role. The actual plan for what we hoped was going to be the summit bid was that Pete and Joe would move swiftly, firstly straight up to Snow Cave 2, then up to Snow Cave 3, and then go for the unclimbed part of the pinnacles, the crux of the climb, to join the North Ridge and hopefully go on to the top of the mountain. Now, on coming back, reversing these pinnacles could have been desperately difficult. And therefore, Adrian, Gordon and I were going to leave Advanced Base Camp and go up to the North Col, wait there for them, and this would mean that Pete and Joe, either having finished the pinnacles, they could either drop down, or having reached the summit, they'd have a safety retreat straight down the North Ridge, which is comparatively easy.
Next day, Charlie Clarke took Dick Renshaw down the mountain, intending to return as soon as possible. And Pete Boardman and Joe Tasker, the only members of the team any longer in a state to try for the summit, prepared to return once more to that desolate and windswept ridge.
I think we were all building ourselves a little front. I don't think we could afford to admit that we were worried and afraid. Now, I know I was afraid quite a lot of the time, and I didn't admit it. And in the same way, when Pete and Joe actually went for the summit, I'll always remember both, well, the whole lead-up period, they were almost conning themselves that it was going to be a pushover going over the pinnacles. And I, because I'd actually pulled out, was then at that point, having decided to pull out, I was, of course, saying, well, God, they look desperately difficult. And I didn't dare say it to them because I didn't want to discourage them. And I'll never forget the night before they actually set out for that final push. And they were quite incredibly tensed.
The route to the North Col proved treacherous and difficult. It took 2 attempts before Chris Bonington and Adrian Gordon reached the crest. Now it was a matter of watching and waiting.
Hello, climbing team, do you read? Over.
Regular calls on the radio produced no response from the ridge. But on the evening of May the 17th, they managed to pick out 2 tiny figures at the bottom of a V between 2 pinnacles before they disappeared from sight. It was the last time Pete Boardman and Joe Tasker were ever seen. Increasingly anxious, they scanned the ridge for any sign of movement. At one point they saw a patch of red high up on the ridge, only to realize it must have been the remains of a tent from some previous expedition. Utterly dejected, the 2 men returned to Advanced Base Camp, where Charlie Clarke was already waiting.
Well, I think the the immediate, or the first reaction, which was well, a long process of growing anxiety from when we last saw them on the night of the 17th through to the 21st, when we finally admitted to ourselves that something had desperately gone wrong and they're almost certainly dead. And that was just a period of sheer, grinding, desperate anxiety. And then kind of through that period you had ups and downs. You had moments when you thought, well, okay, it was going to be all right, when we saw a little red tent.
When we talked about it, when you were on the North Col and I was at advance camp, I don't think there was ever any doubt in either of our minds that they'd had it. Really. I mean, you can't live that long at those altitudes out of sight on a ridge like that. But they are very curious, those emotions, when it happens, because I remember when we first met, we cried and were very upset, and that was overtaken by a quite enormous sense of plans and what we were going to do, and the urgency of potential rescues. And then, as you said before, you go through a mood of I don't say it's jovial in any way, but it isn't misery at all.
There seemed to be only two things that we could now do. One was to actually go up the ridge itself to try to see what had gone wrong. The problem here was that in the first instance, neither Adrian or Charlie were really experienced enough to cope with that kind of difficulty. I'm not at all sure that I could have even got back up to our high point. But on top of that, even if we had got up there, I think we'd have seen very, very little, because actually on the ridge, our vision would have been very, very restricted. On the other hand, if we managed to get round to the other side, to the Kanchung side of the mountain, we could see a lot more. And there was also what I realized was a forlorn hope, but you still couldn't help holding on to it somehow, that perhaps if they had fallen, they'd somehow managed to descend the Kanchung face. So we felt that we just had to get round to the other side of the valley. It was a wonderful walk up the Kanchung Valley. It's a quite incredibly beautiful valley. And we were laughing and joking, and getting on. It was just like a trek. And yet I think the feeling of loss, the worry, the anxiety was always very close to the surface, and something would suddenly bring this out. But at the same time, you also had a kind of, you still had a sense of fun. You needed to have that to be able to survive it, to be able to actually do the things you had to do. And then the next morning, of course, in total contrast to this, was then the really grim moment when you gazed through the telescope and just gazed at that huge, terrifying face, and there's an immense sense of oppression and sadness.